So now we're going to go over the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle basically is separated into two sections, the follicular and the luteal phase. So you remember from before when we talked about how the hormones are being transmitted. So if I have, for example, here, this little structure here, this is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes specific hormones through this structure called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. We talked about that before. And so hypothalamus secretes what in terms of when we look at reproduction? So it secretes GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. This hormone goes through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, through the infundibulum, and then it reaches this region here, which you remember was called what? The anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary begins to secrete two hormones. The two hormones that we talked about before was the FSH and the LH. So follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This pathway is responsible for the production of gametes. And so the FSH and the LH, what is its main function? Is to travel and stimulate the gonads. And because we're looking at the ovarian cycle in this case, we're going to look at the ovaries. So the FSH goes all the way to the ovaries. And so the ovaries are responsible for the production of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, mainly estrogen in this case, but we'll talk more about progesterone. All right, so the way they're regulated is also involved in the ovarian cycle. So the actual phase of follicular phase and the luteal phase are separated by ovulation. So everything before ovulation is coined follicular phase, and anything after is called the luteal phase, right? So right after menses, you have a couple hormones here. So you have, I'm going to separate this graph based off of type of hormone. So these are hormones of the anterior pituitary, and these are hormones, these are your sex steroids, okay? So you have two hormones from the anterior pituitary. One is FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and the other is luteinizing hormone, right? And so you notice that there is a gradual, if I look at this one, so luteinizing hormone, there's a gradual increase that takes place during this time, as well as the same thing for FSH. So there's a gradual increase in concentration of these two hormones. And what you'll notice is that there will be other hormones involved, so the sex hormones, specifically estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen's concentration begins to go up higher. It begins to increase, whereas the progesterone here remains constant, much lower than the estrogen levels, right? And so during this follicular phase, if you remember, we talked about the different follicular development. So you have the primordial follicle beginning to divide and proliferate, becoming the primary follicle. And then we have the secondary follicle. Now we have some of the central antrums being formed. So you have these cavities being created. And then finally, at the rate-limiting cell is the Graafian follicle. So the Graafian follicle, you can actually see the complete separation of the egg, right? And it's ready for ovulation. So LH, usually, if you remember, whenever LH would become high, what would happen? It would cause some kind of negative feedback inhibition that the estrogen, if the estrogen would pass a certain threshold, it would come back and inhibit the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. This is the one instance where this phenomena is false, and actually the estrogen plays a positive feedback loop. It causes an activation or a stimulation of this hormone. So during this phase, you have estrogen going up, and it's constantly going up, and it's not regulated. And now the estrogen plays a positive feedback loop on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, which leads to this spike in hormone concentration. So the luteinizing hormone and the follicular stimulating hormone begin to spike. That spike, that LH spike, triggers ovulation. And ovulation means that the Graafian follicle that is hosting the oocyte shunts it into the fallopian tube in preparation for fertilization.